Deuteronomy chapter 28, beginning in verse 45. Hear the word of the Lord. So all these curses shall come on you and pursue you and overtake you until you are destroyed, because you would not obey the Lord your God by keeping his commandments and his statutes which he commanded you. They shall become a sign and a wonder on you and your descendants forever. Because you did not serve the Lord your God with joy and a glad heart for the abundance of all things, therefore you shall serve your enemies, whom the Lord will send against you, in hunger, in thirst, in nakedness, and in the lack of all things, and he will put an iron yoke on your neck until he has destroyed you. The Lord will bring a nation against you from afar, from the end of the earth, as the eagle swoops down, a nation whose language you shall not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, who will have no respect for the old, nor show favor to the young. Moreover, it shall eat the offspring of your herd and the produce of your ground until you are destroyed, who also leaves you no grain, new wine, or oil, nor the increase of your herd or the young of your flock, until they have caused you to perish. It shall besiege you in all your towns, until your high and fortified walls in which you trusted come down throughout your land, and it shall besiege you in all your towns throughout your land which the Lord your God has given you. Then you shall eat the offspring of your own body, the flesh of your sons and of your daughters, whom the Lord your God has given you, during the siege and the distress by which your enemy will oppress you. The man who is refined and very delicate among you shall be hostile toward his brother, and toward the wife he cherishes, and toward the rest of his children who remain, so that he will not give even one of them any of the flesh of his children which he will eat, since he has nothing else left during the siege and the distress by which your enemy will oppress you in all your towns. The refined and delicate woman among you, who would not venture to set the sole of her foot on the ground of delicateness and refinement, shall be hostile toward the husband she cherishes, and toward her son and daughter, and toward her afterbirth, which issues from between her legs, and toward her children whom she bears. For she will eat them secretly for lack of anything else during the siege and the distress by which your enemy will oppress you in your towns. And may the Lord add a blessing to the hearing and the reading of his word this morning.
A few years ago, one of my sons and I were stopped in traffic behind a pickup truck. You've all seen trucks and cars like this. It was one of those people who wears their opinions on their bumper stickers. So we were sitting there reading the back, and my son pointed to one in particular, and he said, "Dad, what does that sticker mean?" And so I looked at it. It was this sort of oddly shaped sticker with some numbers on it and symbols and a few words. And so I explained to him, I said, see the shape of that? It's got 5 sides. We call that a pentagon. And I said, see those 2 black bars in the middle? Those actually represent buildings. I said, the numbers on there are 9/11, which is September 11th. I said, so the sticker is about 9/11. I said, you remember, we've told you about that before. And he said, oh, yeah. And then he said, I thought 9/11 was bad. I said, well, it was bad. I said, ask anybody who was alive and remembers it then. It was a terrible day. It was sad, it was confusing, it was evil, it was disorienting. A lot of people died. And I said it was a very, very sad event. And then he said, so why does the sticker say, never forget? That's a great question. Why would you want to remember one of the worst days in American history? Well, there are some tragedies and some events and some suffering that should never be forgotten. We could add to 9/11 and think of other events like Pearl Harbor, the Civil Rights Movement, the Trail of Tears, slavery, some of the horrible things that came through these events and through our past. We don't have bumper stickers for these, but we do build monuments. We have whole museums. In fact, you can travel just a few miles up the road and visit the D-Day Memorial. If you've been there, you know that place is an incredibly beautiful place. And yet, if you stop and think about it, it is also an incredibly painful place because of what it stands for and what it represents. Those monuments and those memorials are a lot like that bumper sticker. They say to us, never forget. And the Book of Lamentations in front of us today is a lot like that. On the one hand, this is an incredibly beautiful book. We'll talk a little bit about how intricate the poetry is and the imagery that's present here. It's really unprecedented in the way it's written for the rest of Scripture. And yet, it is an incredibly painful book. Because this book it commemorates, if you will, one of the most unspeakable tragedies and horrors that happened in Israel's history. The judgment and destruction of Jerusalem. And it's as if this book was handed down to generation after generation like a monument or a museum or even a bumper sticker, and this book says to God's people that we should never forget. Because behind the tragedy, there's a story. And behind the story, there is a God. And this God used this event to teach the people then, and He is still using that event to teach His people today as we listen to His Word. If the book of Jeremiah that we just studied is filled with warnings, the book of Lamentations is filled with mournings. It is a book filled with sadness and loss and despair and heartache and pain. It's interesting that it may be one of the most neglected books in the Bible. I don't know if you've ever heard a sermon series all the way through. There's usually one sermon here or there in this book. But it really is a book that deserves our attention. And do you know why that is? Because every single person in this room will go through something like that. You will lose something you love. You will mess up at some point and suffer the consequences. You will go through, if you haven't already, a season of shame and pain, maybe of guilt and of grief. You will go through that inevitably. And the question is, how will you go through it? I've entitled the series in our study, 2 words, Good Grief. Good grief. Because that's what the book is going to do. You are going to go through something that will make you grieve. I will go through something. But brothers and sisters, the question is this: will you and I grieve as those who have no hope? Or will we grieve as Lamentations teaches us to grieve, with hope in God? If you're taking notes this morning, we're going to, again, look at the book as a whole just to introduce it and come back to it in detail. If you're taking notes, we're looking at 3 aspects of the book. First of all, the background, then the outline, and then the message. The background, the outline, and the message. Let's begin then with the background of the book of Lamentations. Anytime you come to a new book of the Bible, I would encourage you, there's two questions to ask right off the bat. Who and when? Who wrote it, and when did they write it? And so let's answer those two questions. Let's start with the authorship of the book. The Book of Lamentations does not say who the author is. So let's move on. No, I'm just kidding. I won't do that. Wouldn't that be terrible if I just, all right. No. If you look at the book, there's no time stamp in the first few verses. You know, most of the prophets start in the year of such and such king, this thing happened. We don't have any of that. In fact, there are no names of humans anywhere in the book. But there are lots of little clues as to who might have written this book. First of all, it's clear to everybody the author was an eyewitness of this tragedy. Flip over to chapter 3 real quick and notice how the beginning of chapter 3, or how chapter 3 begins in verse 1. The author writes, I am the man who has seen affliction. As you read this book, you will see the author writes from a first-hand account. We've all seen news clips come out of the war in Ukraine, and you've probably seen videos where a reporter will be standing there with a helmet on and a bulletproof vest and a microphone, and behind him is rubble and maybe even a tank off in the distance. And why? He's reporting from having been there. He's right there on the ground. The author of Lamentations was on the ground. He saw the Babylonian chariots. He smelled the Babylonian fire. He heard the Babylonian soldiers scream as they poured into the city walls. He was on the ground, and he writes from that very raw, sort of real experience, having watched the horrors unfold. There were lots of people who witnessed this, but one person we know that witnessed this was a prophet by the name of Jeremiah. This is the traditional view for the authorship. If you notice, Lamentations comes right after Jeremiah in the English Bible. You probably know Jeremiah had a nickname. Anybody remember what that is? There you go, good. The weeping prophet. We know that because of several events in his book of Jeremiah. But let me show you one more verse. Keep a finger there in Lamentations and turn back to 2 Chronicles just briefly. I think this verse will help as we look at the authorship. Turn back to 2 Chronicles and find chapter 35. The only thing you really need to know is that one of the last kings to die before the Babylonians took over was the good king Josiah. And Josiah has just died in 2 Chronicles 35. Then go to the end of the chapter, look at verse 25. Notice what it says. Then Jeremiah chanted a lament for Josiah. And all the male and female singers speak about Josiah in their lamentations to this day. And they made them an ordinance in Israel. Behold, they are also written in the Lamentations. Now, some scholars think that's actually a different book, the Lamentations of Josiah. It may possibly be this book. Either way, my point is that verse proves Jeremiah was known for writing obituaries. He had a reputation for mourning national tragedies and national losses. And so Jeremiah writing this book makes wonderful sense. If you lost the front cover to a 19th century novel that was a mystery, there's a pretty good odds it was written by Agatha Christie. Right? Like, that's when she lived, and that's what she wrote. Well, guess what? This is when Jeremiah lived, and this is the kind of things that Jeremiah wrote. And so while it is anonymous, it does seem there's good reason to think Jeremiah was the author of the book. That leads us then to the date of the book. If you don't know any other date in the Old Testament, I think maybe this is the one to memorize and remember, and that's the year 586 BC, about 600 years before the birth of Jesus. This was the year that Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians. Now, that didn't happen overnight. If you know the story, for centuries, God had sent prophet after prophet, Jeremiah being the last one in this case, who came and preached to them, told Judah, turn back. They saw Israel taken by Assyria. They saw what would happen, and they preached and begged the people, turn back to God, Don't form alliances with the nations. Don't trust in them. Don't look to them. Look to the Lord, and if we don't, God will punish us. But they didn't listen. But that warning didn't start with the prophets. Did you catch the scripture reading earlier? What book is that from? Deuteronomy. Did you listen to the details? 800 years before these events, Moses threatened them. God threatened them with exile in their constitution. He said, this is what's going to happen, and then described in tremendous detail what would take place. And so Moses was telling them, for every generation, if we ignore God and reject God, He will reject us. If we curse God, He will curse us. If we turn our back on God, He will turn our back on us, and we will deserve it. And so Moses preached, and the prophets preached, and Jeremiah preached, but nobody listened, and the outcome was just as they predicted. I've never seen the Book of Lamentations depicted in a children's story Bible. There's probably good reason for that. If they made Lamentations a Netflix series, it would be rated TVMA. This is for mature audiences. In 586, Jeremiah sees and records some of the most unspeakable horrors imaginable. Not just of war and looting and destruction and bloodshed, but even rape and of cannibalism. He describes not women being destroyed and families being destroyed, buildings being destroyed, storehouses destroyed, and worst of all, he describes the temple itself being destroyed. And that was a devastating moment in 586. Why? Because when the Babylonians destroyed and razed the temple, that they didn't just, the Israelites didn't just say, oh, that means your army is stronger than our army. The message of the Babylonians was, see, our gods are stronger than your God. Our gods are the true God. Your God is weak. Your God can't protect you. Our gods are the true God. You ever had a moment in life when your experience and your theology don't line up? And you think, wait a minute. That's not how that's supposed to happen. If God, I thought God loved me, why am I going through pain? I thought God answered or listened to me. Why is He not answering my prayers? The Book of Lamentations explores that moment that we all get to when what we go through and what we seem to know about God doesn't seem to mesh or make sense. And so 586 was an unforgettable year for Jeremiah and the nation. So that's a bit of the background to the book. That leads us then to the outline of Lamentations. The Book of Lamentations is just 5 chapters long. I hope and trust some of you read it this week in anticipation with the schedule in the bulletin. If not, it is the Lord's Day. Let me urge you, it takes about 20 minutes to read. Spend some time this afternoon. Read the whole book, and it will set you up well for the study that's before us. In English, we call it, of course, Lamentations. But in Hebrew, the title of the book is just the word how. How. In fact, it's a key word in the book. Flip back to chapter 1 for a moment. Let me show you a few places it shows up. Chapter 1, verse 1, it begins, how lonely sits the city. Then find, if you will, chapter 2, the first verse again, very clearly it begins, how the Lord has covered the daughter of Zion with a cloud in His anger. It does it again in chapter 4, verse 1. Chapter 4 begins, how dark the gold has become, how the pure gold has changed. Isn't that one of the questions we ask when we go through tragedy and loss? We wonder to ourselves, how did I get here? How am I going to move forward? am I going to put these pieces back together? How will my life ever be normal again? Jeremiah is asking that question of God and of his situation. And he asks that question in a most beautiful way. One commentator that I read this week said, great art and great music often comes from great pain. And this book is a testament to that. This book is poetry. Each of the 5 chapters are separate poems, actually songs that were sung. But the poetry actually has some really interesting features, and they actually have kind of a lesson to them. One of them you cannot see in English, so I'm sorry for that, but I think it's actually significant. So let me just explain it for a second. The poetry here, English poetry usually relies on rhyme. Right? You remember Cat in the Hat? Okay, rhyme. Hebrew poetry often relies on syllables. Remember that from school? Syllables, right? It's the sounds that a word makes. And when the poetry, in Hebrew poetry, they often came in even syllables. So it'd be like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 1, 2. And when they repeated that pattern, you could see, oh, that's intentional, and so they were writing poetry. The Book of Lamentations has this very unusual form where all of the syllables are off by 1. So it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. And so in the original, as you read it, it actually, the whole time you read it, it's like something is wrong. Something is off. It's like something is missing. And isn't that exactly how grief makes us feel? Isn't that exactly that gut instinct? When you go to the family reunion and the grandparents that were there last year aren't there this year, and something is off. You lose a job after 20 years and you go to the new job and the coffee tastes different. The commute is a little bit longer, and just life, something seems off. You move to a new place and you have to leave behind family and friends, and something seems off. And I think that Lamentations is validating the very disorienting feeling that loss brings. And it's okay to feel that way. And Jeremiah filled a book with that feeling for us. But there's another part of the poetry that I think is interesting, and that is, if you notice, all of the chapters have 22 verses, except for chapter 3, which has 66. And that's because the chapters are written as a Hebrew acrostic. In fact, many of your Bibles even, maybe if you have a study Bible, you will see between the verses the Hebrew letters, Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, so on and so forth. Each line starts with a letter like A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It goes all the way down. And in chapter 3, it's 3 times. It's AAA, BBB, CCC, all the way down. That was not an accident. That was on purpose. So why does Jeremiah spend the time to do that? Think about it. If you've ever gone through loss and pain, you know how tempting it is just to sort of sit in your sadness and just to wallow in your misery? You know that feeling? You don't want to get out of bed. You don't want to eat anything. You don't want to get dressed. You don't feel like taking a shower. All you feel is in the doldrums. And it's like the acrostic of Lamentations reminds us that grief is a journey. It's like you just got to keep going. How do you get through the alphabet? 1 letter at a time. And then you eventually get to the end. So how do you go through grief? 1 step at a time. You don't need to worry about L, M, N, O, P if you're back here at A. Just think about where you are and what's next. And Jeremiah shows us how to slowly walk through the grief and pain. It also, I think, reminds us to explore our grief from A to Z. You ever meet somebody that go through a loss and they kind of grieve it for a season, and it's like they stop at G, and 10, 20 years later they go, man, I don't think I ever dealt with that. I don't feel like I ever got over the fact this divorce happened, or that I lost this job, or that I had this miscarriage. I never really dealt with that because I had to have a stiff upper lip and just move on with life. And Jeremiah reminds us, no, sometimes we have to explore grief from every angle. Some days you'll be glad, some days you'll be sad, some days you'll be mad. That's okay. There are days when in your grief and pain, we are to work through this. This book calls us not just to cry a few tears and move on. It gives us permission to scream and shout and feel and question and even to pound our fists into the chest of God and say, how? How could you let this happen? How am I going to move on? How am I going to deal with this loss? The poetry is incredibly powerful. And I think it reinforces the message of the book. Now, I promised you an outline, so let me give it to you, and then we'll look at the message. Jeremiah writes the book, but he writes the book as though several different people are talking. And so that makes it kind of hard sometimes to figure out who's talking at this point. So let me kind of show you what that is. First of all, in chapters 1 and 2, the city grieves. The city grieves. That is Jerusalem. It is Zion. It is the capital city, the prominent city of Israel. If you go back to chapter 1, you may want to look here. Verse 1 begins, how lonely sits the city that was full of people. She has become like a widow. You can almost imagine the city of Zion like a woman dressed in black with a veil over her face, clutching a handful of tissues and laying prostrate over a pile of dirt in a cemetery, and just weeping uncontrollably. And throughout the chapter, he describes her in this state of misery and loss and emptiness. And she finally speaks in verse 12. And notice what she asks. Is it nothing to all you that pass by? Look and see if there is any pain like my pain. She knows, by the way, that she deserved it. Now again, one difference here is that Israel, Judah, set themselves up for this. This loss was their own doings. But nevertheless, even as she reels through that, it's as if she says, we know we deserve to be punished, but God, this feels like too much. This feels excessive to us. Have you really abandoned us and left us forever? You ever go through a season of life when it seems like it only rains and then pours, and things get worse and worse, and you just think, how much more can I go through? She's very honest about how she feels in those chapters. In chapters 3 and 4, number 2, we see that the prophet grieves. The prophet grieves. Jeremiah, in these 2 chapters, talks about this national tragedy as if it were a personal tragedy. In other words, he describes what happens to the buildings, but he describes it as if it's happening to his own body. Notice in chapter 3, if you look at verse 4, He, that's God, has caused my flesh and my skin to waste away. He has broken my bones. He has besieged and encompassed me with bitterness and hardship. Now again, literally, the city was besieged by soldiers, surrounded by soldiers, but Jeremiah writes about it as if he himself feels like he's the one being kidnapped, as if he himself is going through this. By the way, is that not a great reminder that many times grief is incredibly personal? It hurts to the deepest part and core of who you are. That sometimes you don't even know what to say. You just moan in your sadness. It can affect you mentally and spiritually and emotionally and physically. In fact, I think I would argue we are never more human than when we grieve. It taps into the deepest parts of who we are. And Jeremiah talks in chapters 3 and 4 about how horrified he was, the trauma of seeing mothers eat their children. And basically we would call PTSD of what it's like trying to make sense of this. A few weeks ago, a church member asked me if I had read the sex abuse report in the SBC. This was a while back before it came out. And I said, at that point, I'd read a few things, but not everything. And the church member said, I read it, and she said, it made me sick to my stomach. Now, she wasn't personally responsible for that, right? Like her name wasn't, it wasn't like she did something, but knowing and being part of this and watching this, it cut her deeply. And she identified and felt the pain and the grief over other people's sins. Likewise, Jeremiah, he's the one saying, don't do it. And yet, in the midst of it, he feels the need to confess the sins of the nation and to call out to God, and he feels the deepest part of who he is, this pain and this loss. So the prophet grieves. And finally, the remnant grieves in chapter 5. The remnant grieves. When we think about the exile happening, we often remember that people were kidnapped. The Babylonians came in, and the Jewish people were taken out. And when we think about exile, we think, oh yeah, they were taken away from the land. And so they were in Jerusalem, right? The Babylonians came in, and then we think, oh yeah, they picked them up, and they kidnapped them and took them way over here, right? And so we think about, oh yeah, this is exile, living over here in a land away from home, right, wanting to go back. That's all true. And when we read this, you remember Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego? They were ones taken out, and they're over here. That's where those stories come from, over here in exile. And we often think of the exile from this vantage point. But what do you think it was like to be one of the people left in Jerusalem? To have to bury your neighbors, dozens at a time. To see the broken down, charred walls. To live with the horrors of that memory. How would you feel being left and then all your family and friends are taken away? How desperate would you be? That's chapter 5. The remnant cries out to God. How long, O Lord? Why have you forgotten us? And they grieve their loss. We'll see more as we go through this book in the weeks ahead, chapter by chapter, but I hope you see the overview of the outline. That leads us then finally to the message of the Book of Lamentations. There's lots of themes in this book, but as I've said, I think a dominant theme for our study will be the theme of grief. Remember, it is called what? Lamentations. It is a book of lamenting, a book of sorrow, a book of mourning. And so that begs the question, what is grief? I read an author this week, and I thought this was so helpful. He described it as this. He says, grief is the inward desolation that we feel after losing something or someone we love. The inward destruction, the hole, that chasm, that feeling you have after losing something or someone you love. And then he goes on to add, and that can be anything. A spouse, a child, a pet, a job, a dream, a marriage, a home, a hope. Every one of us have lost things like that. And it's important to remember that where does grief come from? Grief comes from love. It's because you love something and lost something. When you mix love with loss, you get grief. And the Jewish people loved Jerusalem. They loved their homeland. They loved their temple. Now, at times, they loved it more than they loved God. But in some respects, it was the manifestation of God's promises. It was the physical reminder of God's blessings and the things that he would do through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And there's a sense in which when God gave them Jerusalem and gave them Zion and gave them that hill, they said, yes, that means God is for us. So if the gift of Jerusalem means God is for us, does the destruction of Jerusalem now mean God hates us? Does it mean God is against us? Does it mean God has abandoned us? When you go through the pain and the loss of something you love, does that mean now God's turned his back on you? Lamentations explores all those kinds of questions. And if I could sum it up for you in just a sentence, I think the message of Lamentations is this: good grief is a mixture of tears and talk and trust. Good grief is a mixture of tears and talk and trust. Jeremiah is the weeping prophet. The pages, every verse is soaked in his tears. In fact, he doesn't just cry for a few verses and wipe his nose and say, all right, let's move on now. Suck it up, buttercup, and, life's got to continue. In every chapter, he's crying or lamenting or mourning or moaning. And how often do we, when we go through some loss, maybe we'll shed a tear for a day or go through a moment, but we say, oh no, I got to move on. I got to go through this. And we find ourselves with these mixed emotions and strange feelings for many years to come. Grief is often described as the waves of the ocean. They sometimes crash harder and sometimes more subtle, but they continue to come over and over again. And Lamentations gives us permission to do that. Some people will say, well, real men don't cry. Well, Jeremiah cried. He was a real man. Job cried. He too was a real man. And most of all, the Lord Jesus cried. And he was the ultimate man. In fact, he stood on a hill overlooking Jerusalem and wept over them because 600 years later they would do it again. And he loved them. But he was losing them from their hard-heartedness and their rebellion. And he said, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I long to gather you as a hen gathers her chicks underneath her wings. And yet you've stoned the prophets. You've not listened to me. And Jesus knew that their rebellion, where it was going to lead, the result of their sin was that he would go to the cross. He would bear the wrath of God, the weight of sin. You see, where there is sin, the price has to be paid. And Jesus went to the cross to pay the penalty for sin. And he rose from the dead to show that he has conquered that. And yet he stood on that side of the cross and he wept, knowing what their sin would lead to. We live in a world of fallenness and ruin, of brokenness and sickness and pain and disease and death. And my friends, Lamentations reminds us that when we lose something we love, it's okay to cry and it's okay to let the tears out. You know why? Because one day he will wipe away every tear. He will remove our pain. No more death, no more sickness. And that is accomplished through the death and resurrection of Christ, where he will restore all things to himself. But until that day when there's no tears, we weep. And we weep with those that weep. Good grief also requires talk. It also requires talk. Jeremiah is bearing his soul in this book. As I said, a lot of this book is him confessing sins. My friends, that is the only right response to sin, is to confess it. Talk about it. Don't hide it. Don't push it down. Don't change the language and make yourself feel better. If you mess up, fess up, as I tell my kids. Jeremiah is fessing up for the nation and repenting of the wrong that they have done. And my friends, you will find that if you humble yourself, God gives grace to the humble, but he resists the proud. No, I didn't do anything. I don't need to confess. I had nothing wrong. No, you can't tell me what to do. Then you're not going to get past it. Jeremiah confesses his sins. But not only that, he talks through the memories. I mean, it's literally like PTSD, where he's saying, having these flashbacks of things that he saw. He questions God about things. He talks to God about these things. It's almost like he's protesting in some ways. And my friends, good grief requires that we're honest. This is what I went through, and this is how I feel. The prophet talks, the city talks, the remnant talks, everybody talks. Actually, there's one person that doesn't talk in this book, and you know who that is? It's God. God never says a word directly. There's no thus saith the Lord. It isn't that he cries out and God says, okay, Jeremiah, enough of that, let's move on now. No, God is not speak. And by the way, isn't that what grief feels like? That God's not around? God, where are you? In the midnight hour, God, are you hearing me? Do you know what's going on? My friends, if God is not speaking, rest assured He is most definitely listening. And the beauty of this book is that Jeremiah talks and gets it out, and the whole time God is listening. And it's almost like Lamentations is God's way of saying, listen, when you pour out your soul to me, I will listen and I will weep with you. I will climb down in the ditch with you. I will come and take on your pain. And my friends, is that not the incarnation? God came down to where we were in our brokenness. He condescended to be among us. He heard our cries. He heard our enslavement to sin. And so He came through Christ to set us free. You may think everybody's tired of hearing me talk about my complaints and my loss and my hardship. I promise you, God is not tired. He will listen to you. He will listen to you. And good grief requires talk. Finally, good grief requires trust. Lamentations is a very dark book. It has a lot of dark themes, a lot of dark images, a lot of dark poetry. But there is one little glimmer of hope in the middle of the book. Turn to Lamentations 3, and I'll show it to you. If you know anything about the book, you probably know this. Lamentations chapter 3, verse 21. In the middle of his confession and prayer and protest, Jeremiah says, verse 21, "This I recall to my mind, therefore I have hope. The Lord's loving kindness indeed never ceases, for His compassions never fail. They are new every morning." And then what? "Great is thy faithfulness." There's a reason we sing that at funerals. Jeremiah sang it at Israel's funeral. He cries out to God. You see, I think good grief is that moment when you can, in all raw honesty, say, my grief and my pain is great and my sadness is great, but I also recognize that the Lord's faithfulness is great. And that both can be true at the same time. You don't have to try to sort it out and make sense of it. You can confess one and the other. And Jeremiah sees and knows and confesses, and God reveals, listen, you may lose. You may lose your family. You may lose your spouse. You may lose your job. You may lose your health. You may lose everything, but the promise of this book is you will never lose God. Because great is His faithfulness. And my friends, He can use your hurts to get at your heart, that you might come to Him and lean on Him and trust in Him and to have hope even in the darkness. So it's a dark book, but there's a little bit of hope that with good grief can come trust in God and hope that He is working for our good.